The river gave her up on a February morning when the fog still clung to the water like a burial shroud. She was found below Hammersmith Bridge, on the foreshore of the Thames, where the tide had pushed her against the cold stones, as if the city itself wished to confess what it had done. She was naked. Her stockings had been rolled to her ankles, and her undergarments had been forced down her throat. Several of her teeth were missing. The year was 1964, and London was supposed to be swinging. The newspapers spoke of new music, of liberation, of a Britain finally shaking off the grey dust of the post-war years. But beneath the glamour, beneath the noise, something older moved through the western suburbs, something that carried no name and left no shadow. It moved along the riverbank and through the quiet lanes, and when it was finished with its work, it left its victims bare and broken in the cold. The police wrote "probable suicide" beside Hannah Tailford's name, and the city turned the page. It would not turn so easily again, for the Thames was not yet done giving up its dead, and the killing had only just begun. Chapter 1. The River and the Silence. Good evening and welcome. The night has settled now wherever you are, and the world outside has grown quieter than it was an hour ago. Perhaps you are lying in bed with the lights already dimmed. Perhaps you are driving through empty roads, with the city falling behind you, or perhaps you are simply sitting in the stillness of a room where no one else is awake. Wherever you are and whatever hour it is where you find yourself, you have arrived at the right place. This is the Bedside Historian, and tonight we travel backward, not to kings and cathedrals, not to battlefields or thrones, but to a stretch of river in West London, where the water ran grey and cold beneath iron bridges, and where the bodies of forgotten women were pulled from the mud one by one, stripped bare of clothing and dignity, and laid upon slabs in mortuaries that smelled of carbolic and damp stone. It is not a story the city wished to remember. But memory, like the river, does not obey the wishes of those who live beside it. Before we begin, if you are new to this channel, take a moment now to subscribe and to leave a like on this video. It is a small thing, but it is the thing that keeps these stories alive and allows this channel to grow. Your support means a great deal and is deeply appreciated. Now then, let the lights go low. Let the noise of the day drain away. And let us go to London. Not the London of postcards and Parliament, not the London of red buses and royal processions, but the London that existed in the margins, in the unlit lanes behind the riverside pubs, in the rooming houses of Shepherd's Bush and Notting Hill, in the narrow flats above the shops of Bayswater Road, where women lived alone, or with other women, sharing rent and silence, and the understanding that no one on the outside cared very much about what happened to them after dark. This was the London of the early 1960s, and it was a city caught between two versions of itself. On one side stood the Britain that was dying, the post-war nation of rationing and deference, of grey buildings and greyer expectations, where men wore hats and women were expected to endure. On the other side stood the Britain that was being born, the swinging city of new fashion and new music, of coffee bars and jazz clubs and a loosening of the old moral codes that had governed English life for generations. Between these two Britons, in the cracks where neither light fully reached, lived the women of the streets. They were not called by polite names in the newspapers. When they were mentioned at all, which was seldom, they were referred to as women of ill repute, or common prostitutes, or simply as unfortunates. The law treated them as nuisances. The Metropolitan Police arrested them for soliciting, fined them, released them, and arrested them again the following week. The courts processed them without curiosity. The public looked past them as though they were part of the pavement. And in the western reaches of the city, along the stretch of the Thames that wound through Hammersmith and Chiswick and Brentford and Acton, these women walked the same streets each night, stood beneath the same lampposts, climbed into the same cars, and returned to the same cars, and returned to the same cold rooms when the work was done. They were, by a measure of their era, invisible, and it was precisely this invisibility that would make them perfect victims. The Thames in West London was not the Thames of Tower Bridge and the Houses of Parliament. It was wider here, slower, and far less watched. The northern bank was lined with boathouses and sailing clubs, with patches of scrubland and quiet meadows where lovers went after dark, and where women brought their clients when no room was available. Duke's Meadows, near Chiswick, had earned a reputation that no council signpost would ever acknowledge. It was a place of transaction, a place where money changed hands in the front seats of parked cars, and where the only witnesses were the swans that drifted along the water's edge in the early hours of the morning. The towpath that ran beside the river was unlit in long stretches. The bridges threw heavy shadows across the foreshore, and when the tide went out, the Thames revealed its mudflats, dark and silted and strewn with the debris of the city, old timber, broken glass, lengths of rope, and occasionally something worse. It was a landscape made for concealment. A body left on the foreshore at low tide would be covered again within hours, carried by the current, tumbled against the stones, and deposited wherever the river chose. The Metropolitan Police knew this. They had pulled bodies from the Thames for as long as there had been a Metropolitan Police. Suicides were common. Accidents were not unusual. And in the case of women who lived as these women lived, the assumption was almost always the same. She fell. She jumped. She was drunk. She was troubled. No one looked further. No one asked whether the marks on the throat were consistent with strangulation rather than the drag of the current. No one questioned why her clothing was missing, or why her undergarments had been forced into her mouth, or why several of her teeth had been removed. These were not the sort of questions that were asked about the sort of women who ended up in the river. And so the Thames kept its counsel, and the dead kept theirs. The world above the waterline, meanwhile, was vibrating with change. In 1963, the year before the first confirmed killing, Britain had been convulsed by the Profumo affair, a scandal that reached from the bed of a Mayfair showgirl to the corridors of Whitehall and the chambers of the House of Commons. John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War, had conducted an affair with Christine Keeler, a young woman whose social circle included a Soviet naval attaché named Yevgeny Ivanov. The affair was exposed, Profumo lied to Parliament, and when the truth emerged, the government of Harold Macmillan was shaken to its foundations. At the centre of the scandal stood Stephen Ward, a society osteopath and portrait artist who had introduced Keeler to Profumo and who was subsequently charged with living off immoral earnings. Ward's trial at the Old Bailey in the summer of 1963 became a national spectacle, a theatre of moral outrage in which the British establishment sought to punish one man for the sins of an entire class. Ward took an overdose of barbiturates before the verdict was read. He never regained consciousness. The Profumo affair had revealed something that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. Beneath the surface of the establishment, beneath the dinner parties and the country houses and the gentlemen's clubs, there existed a network of transactions in which women were currency. Cool girls moved through drawing rooms and embassy receptions. Underground parties were held in private homes where the rules of daylight did not apply. And the women who serviced this world, from the high-class escorts of Mayfair to the street workers of Bayswater, occupied a space that was simultaneously desired and despised. They were used and discarded, welcomed in the dark and denied in the light. And when harm came to them, the machinery of justice moved slowly, if it moved at all. It was into this world that the killer stepped. Or perhaps he had been there all along, waiting in the geography of the western suburbs, learning the routes and the rhythms, watching the women come and go beneath the bridges and along the towpaths. He left no letters. He issued no warnings. He did not seek attention from the press or taunt the police with cryptic messages. He simply killed and stripped and disposed and vanished. And because his victims were who they were, because they lived in the margins where no one kept careful count, it took time for anyone to notice that a pattern was forming, that the river was yielding the same kind of body again and again, and that the women of West London streets were being harvested by something far worse than the cold. The geography of the killings was remarkably concentrated. Nearly every body was found within a few miles of the Thames, in a corridor that stretched from Hammersmith in the east to Acton in the west, passing through Chiswick, Brentford, and the quiet residential streets that backed on to industrial estates and trading yards. This was not fashionable London. This was the London of small factories and warehouses, of paint shops and engineering works, of terraced houses with thin walls and back gardens that overlooked railway lines. The streets were busy during the day and deserted at night. The industrial estates were locked behind chain-link fences after hours, guarded by a handful of night watchmen who made their rounds with torches and flasks of tea. It was a landscape of gaps and silences, of places where a van could reverse without being seen, and a body could be left without being found until morning. The women who worked these streets came from all parts of the British Isles. They came from mining towns in the northeast of England, from farming communities in Scotland, from the terraced rows of industrial Wales, and from the grey villages of Ireland. They had arrived in London with varying degrees of hope some chasing opportunity, some fleeing hardship, some simply drifting until they found themselves in a city that had no particular use for them except one. They were, almost without exception, small in stature. They were young, or had been young not long ago. They had children, in some cases children who had been taken into care or left with relatives who asked few questions. They had convictions for soliciting, for petty theft, for being drunk and disorderly. They had histories that the courts recorded in dry lines of ink and that the newspapers ignored entirely. And they had names. Names that would not appear in the headlines until after they were dead, and even then only briefly, before the city moved on. The police force that would eventually be tasked with finding their killer was the Metropolitan Police, an institution that in the early 1960s was undergoing its own quiet crisis. The Met had been battered by a series of corruption scandals in the late 1950s, and public confidence in Scotland Yard was not what it had once been. The Criminal Investigation Department, the CID, was staffed by experienced detectives, but the methods available to them were limited by the technology of the time. There was no national DNA database. There were no CCTV cameras watching the streets. Forensic science existed, but it was painstaking and slow, reliant on fibres and fingerprints and the observations of pathologists who worked in mortuaries that had changed little since the Victorian era. The primary tools of detection remained the interview, the informant, and the door-to-door inquiry, and these tools were only as effective as the community's willingness to cooperate. In the world of the streets, cooperation with the police was rare. The women did not trust the officers who arrested them each week. The men who used their services had every reason to remain silent, and the killer, whoever he was, appeared to understand this perfectly. There was one more element of the landscape that would prove essential to the story, and that was the industrial estate. Specifically, the Heron Trading Estate in Acton, a sprawl of low buildings and storage sheds and workshops that sat behind a quiet residential area in the western suburbs. The estate housed a number of small businesses, among them a spray painting shop that serviced motor vehicles. The shop used industrial paint, applied with compressed air guns, and the fine mist of paint that escaped the spray booth settled on every surface within reach, on walls, on floors, on the undersides of transformers, and on anything or anyone that passed through the area after dark. This paint, invisible to the naked eye but detectable under laboratory conditions, would become the single most important piece of forensic evidence in the entire investigation, but that discovery lay months in the future, beyond more bodies, more silence, and more failure. For now, in the early weeks of 1964, London knew nothing of what was coming. The Beatles had just returned from their first American tour. The new Labour leader, Harold Wilson, was preparing to challenge the Conservative government in the coming general election. The fashion houses of Carnaby Street were drawing young people from across the country, and the coffee bars of Soho stayed open later than they ever had before. Britain was looking forward, or at least it believed it was. But along the Thames, in the unlit stretches between Hammersmith and Chiswick, the water lapped against the stones in its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the decade, indifferent to the music and the noise. The river had seen everything. It had carried the dead before, and on a cold morning in February, when the fog hung so low that the far bank was invisible, a body surfaced near the pylons of Hammersmith Bridge, and the current nudged it gently toward the shore, as though offering it up to whoever cared enough to look. No one was looking. Not yet. The city was loud, and the river was patient, and the dead woman on the foreshore had no voice left with which to cry out. But she would not be the last. The river would give up more before the year was through, and somewhere in the western suburbs, in a street that looked like any other street, in a house or a flat or a workshop that no one had yet thought to search, the man who had put her there was already thinking about the next one. The fog thickened. The tide began to turn, and London, swinging and oblivious, danced on. Chapter 2. The Women Before the Name. The story, as it is most often told, begins in February of 1964, with the body of Hannah Tailford beneath Hammersmith Bridge, but the river had spoken before that morning. It had whispered, years earlier, in the same stretch of water, along the same mud flats, in the same quiet parks where the willows trailed their branches into the current, and the only sound after midnight was the slow creak of moored boats against their chains. If anyone had been listening, they might have heard the first notes of the melody that would later become a dirge, but no one was listening. The women who died before the pattern was recognized died alone, and they were buried in the silence that the city reserved for those it considered beneath its attention. The first of these women was Elizabeth Figg. She was 21 years old, and she had come to London from Cheshire, drawn by whatever combination of necessity and hope drives a young woman away from a small life and toward a large city that does not know her name. She had settled in the Chiswick area of West London, in the kind of accommodation that left no lasting impression on the streets around it, a rented room, a shared hallway, a front door that opened onto a pavement where no one lingered. She was slight in build, quiet in manner, and young-looking for her age. The sort of woman who could pass through a crowd without being remembered. She supplemented her income, whatever that income was, by working occasionally as a prostitute, though the word in the vocabulary of the time covered a multitude of circumstances. From the high-class escort who dined at the Savoy to the woman who climbed into a stranger's car on a dark road for the price of a meal, Elizabeth Figg was closer to the latter. She worked the streets near the river, in the area around Duke's Meadows, where the park met the towpath and the towpath met the water, and where the darkness was deep enough to swallow a transaction whole. On the night of Tuesday, the 16th of June 1959, Elizabeth Figg was seen getting into a vehicle driven by a man. She was not seen alive again. Her body was discovered the following morning, at 10 minutes past 5, by police officers carrying out a routine patrol of Duke's Meadows. The park had a reputation that was well known to the local constabulary. It was a place where couples went after the pubs closed, and where women of the streets brought their clients when no indoor space was available. The officers found Figg on a stretch of rough ground between Dan Mason Drive and the river's towpath, approximately 200 yards west of Barnes Bridge. Her dress had been torn at the waist and pulled open to expose her body. Marks around her neck were consistent with strangulation. Her underwear was missing. Her shoes were missing. Her handbag, which had been white, was missing. No identification and no personal possessions were found anywhere near the body. A pathologist examined her and concluded that death had occurred between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. A post-mortem photograph of her face was distributed to the press, and it was this photograph, clinical and stark, that was independently recognised by her roommate and by her mother, who identified her as the girl from Cheshire who had gone to London and not come home. The police searched the area around Duke's Meadows with some diligence. They combed the scrubland. They dragged sections of the riverbed. They found nothing. No underwear, no shoes, no handbag, no weapon, no trace of the man whose car she had entered. The investigation, such as it was, produced no suspects, no arrests, and no resolution. Elizabeth Figg's death was filed among the unsolved cases of the Metropolitan Police, and the file gathered dust in the archives of Scotland Yard. She had been a young woman of no particular importance to the apparatus of the state, and the apparatus of the state responded accordingly. The case was not closed precisely, but it was not pursued. It simply sat, like the body had sat on the rough ground by the river, waiting for someone to come along and understand what it meant. 4 years passed. 4 years in which the city changed around the place where Elizabeth Figg had died, in which new buildings went up and old ones came down, in which governments shifted and fashions turned, and the music on the wireless moved from skiffle to rock and roll, and then to something that the young people called beat. Duke's Meadows remained. The towpath remained. The river remained unchanged by any of it, carrying its freight of debris and sediment and memory toward the sea. And then, on the 8th of November, 1963, another body was found. Her name was Gwynneth Rees, though she had used other names in the course of her short life, among them Tina Smart and Tina Dawson. Names adopted for the street, names that could be discarded when the night was over. She was 22 years old, and she had been born in Wales, in one of those valleys where the coal industry had once sustained entire communities, and where, by the early 1960s, the pits were closing and the young were leaving for the cities. Gwynneth Rees had left for London, and London had received her with its customary indifference. She had found her way to the streets of West London, to the same territory where Elizabeth Figg had worked 4 years earlier, and she had fallen into the same life, the same routine of curb and car and rented room. She was petite, as Figg had been. She was vulnerable, as Figg had been. And she had been strangled, as Figg had been. Her body was discovered not on the riverbank, but in a council refuse tip in Mortlake, south of the Thames, buried among the rubbish that the city discarded each day. She was naked, or nearly so, stripped of her clothing in a manner that echoed the condition in which Figg had been found. She had been strangled with a ligature, something thin and strong that had been pulled tight around her throat until the breath stopped. Several of her teeth were missing. Her underwear had been found lodged in her throat, a detail so specific and so deliberate that it could not have been accidental, could not have been the result of a struggle or a fall or the careless handling of a body. It was a signature, though no one used that word at the time. It was a mark left by a hand that had done this before, or would do it again, or both. The parallels between the deaths of Elizabeth Figg and Gwynneth Rees were noted by some investigators, but the connection was not formally established. The cases had occurred 4 years apart, in slightly different locations, under circumstances that could be explained by the general dangers of street work rather than by the specific actions of the single killer. The Metropolitan Police did not, in 1963, declare that the two murders were linked. They did not announce that a pattern was forming. They did not warn the women of the western suburbs that someone among their clients might be something other than what he appeared. The investigation into Gwynneth Rees's death followed a path similar to that of Elizabeth Figg's. Inquiries were made. Witnesses were sought. None were found. The file was added to the growing collection of unsolved cases, and the dead woman from Wales joined the dead woman from Cheshire in the long silence of the archives. It is worth pausing here, in the stillness between these early deaths and the storm that was about to break, to consider what it meant to be a woman of the streets in London in the early 1960s. The law, first of all, was not on their side. The Street Offences Act of 1959 had been designed to clear the streets of visible prostitution, and its effect was to drive the trade into darker corners, into less visible locations, into the backs of cars and the edges of parks where there were no witnesses and no protection. A woman who was arrested for soliciting could expect a fine, a night in the cells, and a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. A woman who was assaulted by a client could expect, at best, skepticism from the officers who took her statement. At worst, she could expect to be charged herself for wasting police time or for conduct likely to cause a breach of the peace. The system was not designed to protect these women. It was designed to make them disappear, and when they did disappear, when they vanished from the streets and turned up dead in the river or in a rubbish tip, the system responded with the same indifference that had governed its treatment of them when they were alive. The women themselves existed in a network that was informal, fluid, and largely invisible to those who did not inhabit it. They knew each other. They shared information about clients, about safe areas and dangerous ones, about men who paid fairly and men who did not pay at all. They shared flats, sometimes sharing not just the rent, but the burden of children who needed feeding and clothing and keeping out of harm's way. Some of them had connections to the murkier reaches of London's nightlife, to the world of strip clubs and private parties, and the making of what were then called stag films. Crude pornographic movies, shot on grainy stock in rented rooms, and distributed through networks that operated well beyond the reach of the law. This underground economy overlapped in places with the world of organised crime, with the protection rackets and the gambling dens and the clubs that operated in Soho and the West End, under the watchful eyes of men whose names were known to the police, but whose operations were tolerated as long as the violence remained within certain boundaries. The women moved through this world without power and without protection, dependent on the goodwill of men who had very little goodwill to spare. It was a world in which disappearance was common. Women moved from one area to another, changed their names, changed their associates, dropped out of contact with friends and family for weeks or months at a time. A woman who stopped appearing at her usual corner might have moved to another part of the city, or might have gone back to wherever she had come from, or might have been arrested and sent to prison for a few weeks. The possibility that she had been killed was considered, but not with any urgency, because these things happened, had always happened, and would continue to happen. And there was a limit to how much the institutions of the state were willing to invest in the lives of women who had placed themselves, as the prevailing morality saw it, beyond the pale of respectable concern. This was the world in which the killer operated, and it was a world that suited him perfectly. His victims were women whose movements were irregular. His connections to family and community were frayed or broken, and whose disappearance would not trigger the kind of immediate alarm that would follow the vanishing of a shopkeeper's wife or a school teacher or a nurse. He could take a woman from a street corner or from a parked car, and he could do with her what he wished, and by the time anyone noticed she was gone, the trail, if there had ever been a trail, would be cold. The river would have washed the foreshore clean. The rain would have soaked into the ground where the body had lain, and the city would have moved on, as it always moved on, without looking back. There is a gap in the timeline that has troubled investigators ever since the case was first examined as a whole. Between the death of Elizabeth Figg in June of 1959 and the death of Gwynneth Rees in November of 1963, more than 4 years elapsed. If both women were killed by the same hand, what happened during those 4 years? Some have speculated that the killer may have been imprisoned for an unrelated offence, a short sentence for a minor crime that would have kept him off the streets for a year or two. Others have suggested that there may have been additionally victims during this period, women who were never reported missing, whose bodies were never found, or whose deaths were attributed to other causes. In a population as transient and as poorly documented as that of the street women of West London, it is entirely possible that a murder could occur without anyone realizing a murder had taken place. A woman could vanish, and the silence that followed would be indistinguishable from the silence that had preceded her. What is certain is that by the end of 1963, 2 women who shared a remarkable number of characteristics had been found dead in the western suburbs of London. Both stripped, both strangled, both small in stature, both engaged in the same dangerous trade. And what is equally certain is that the Metropolitan Police, for all the resources at their disposal, had failed to connect these deaths into a coherent narrative. The files sat in separate drawers, handled by separate officers in separate divisions of a police force that did not yet have the systems or the inclination to cross-reference the killing of one prostitute with the killing of another. The women were dead, and the cases were cold, and the new year was approaching, and with it a winter that would bring the Thames to its lowest temperatures in years, and the fog down so thick over the western suburbs that a man could stand 10 feet from a street lamp and not be seen. 1964 arrived without ceremony. The calendar turned, the fog assisted, and the river ran on in its ancient course, grey and heavy and full of secrets. And somewhere in the streets between Hammersmith and Acton, the killer was already choosing his next. Ekbit, Chapter 3. Hannah and Irene, the 2nd of February 1964, was a cold morning in London. The kind of cold that crept through the walls of the old terraced houses and settled in the bones of anyone who ventured out before the sun had risen high enough to burn the frost from the rooftops. Along the Thames at Hammersmith, the water was the colour of slate, and the fog that had clung to the river through the night was only now beginning to thin, revealing the outlines of the bridges and the boathouses and the low stone wall that separated the towpath from the foreshore. It was here, below Linden House, the clubhouse of the London Corinthian Sailing Club, just west of Hammersmith Bridge, that the body was found. She had been in the water, though not for long. The pathologists would later estimate that she had entered the Thames no more than 24 hours before her discovery, and that she had likely been placed in the water at Duke's Meadows, the same stretch of parkland where Elizabeth Figg had been found 5 years earlier. The current had carried her downstream, tumbling her along the foreshore until she came to rest against the stones below the sailing club. She was naked, save for her stockings, which had been rolled down to her ankles. Her undergarments had been forced into her mouth. She had been strangled. Several of her teeth were missing, and she was 30 years old, though she might have been taken for older, for the years had not been gentle with her, and the life she had lived had left its marks upon her face and her body long before the killer had left his. Her name was Hannah Tailford, and she had been born on the 19th of August 1933 into a mining family in the northeast of England. Her childhood had been difficult in ways that the official records captured only in fragments. She had been excluded from several schools for behaviour that the authorities of the time described as disruptive, a word that covered a multitude of circumstances and concealed more than it revealed. As a teenager, she had run away to London, leaving behind whatever life had been waiting for her in the coalfields, and arriving in a city that had no particular plan for a girl, with no qualifications and no connections. She had quickly found her way into the only trade that asked nothing of her except her presence. She had gained convictions for soliciting and for theft. She had become a mother, twice over, and the children had become part of the quiet wreckage that accumulated around a life lived on the margins. On at least one occasion she had placed a classified advertisement in a local newspaper, offering her unborn child for sale to the highest bidder, a detail so stark in its desperation that it needs no commentary to convey the depth of the poverty in which she lived. Hannah Tailford had been missing for 10 days before her body was found. The last confirmed sighting of her had been on the 24th of January, and in the intervening period no one had reported her absence to the police. No one had made inquiries. No one had raised an alarm. She had simply ceased to be present, and the world around her had continued without adjustment. When her body was pulled from the Thames, the initial police response was muted. The circumstances of her death, while unpleasant, were not unprecedented. Women were found in the river with some regularity, and the assumption in many such cases was suicide, particularly when the woman in question had a history of hardship and a profession that carried its own catalogue of dangers. The coroner considered a verdict of suicide, despite the underwear forced into her mouth, despite the missing teeth, despite the bruising on both sides of her jaw that was consistent with a powerful grip applied to the face. The investigation proceeded without urgency, and the name Hannah Tailford appeared in the newspapers only briefly, in small columns on inside pages, before being overtaken by other news. But Hannah Tailford had not lived entirely in the shadows. There were stories told about her, stories that hinted at a world more complicated and more dangerous than the simple transaction of money for companionship on a dark street. She was said to have had connections to the underground world of private parties and illicit films that thrived in certain corners of London's nightlife. She was known to frequent a coffee stall near Trafalgar Square, where women of the streets gathered in the early hours, and where offers were sometimes made. Offers of money in exchange for participation in activities that went beyond the ordinary. She had told friends of being paid to attend parties at the homes of wealthy men, parties where the normal rules of conduct did not apply and where the guests wore masks or costumes, and the entertainment was of a nature that could never be described in a court of law. One such story involved a house belonging to a French diplomat, where Tailford claimed she had been paid £25 and taken by limousine to a gathering at which a man in a gorilla costume had performed acts upon her, while a crowd of well-dressed onlookers applauded. Whether these stories were true, exaggerated, or invented for effect is impossible to say at this distance, but they placed Hannah Tailford at the edge of a world where powerful men used vulnerable women for their amusement, and where the consequences of knowing too much could be severe. The writer Anthony Summers would later note that Hannah Tailford was peripherally connected to the Perfumer affair, that great convulsion of sex and politics and espionage that had shaken the British establishment to its foundations in 1963. The connections were indirect, running through the same networks of party organisers and club owners and go-betweens who had facilitated the meetings between Christine Keeler and John Profumo. Whether these connections had any bearing on Tailford's death was never established, but they added a layer of shadow to a case that was already dark enough, and they raised questions that the police had neither the mandate nor the inclination to pursue. 2 months passed. The investigation into Hannah Tailford's death had produced nothing of substance. No suspects had been identified. No witnesses had come forward. The file remained open but inactive, and the officers who had been assigned to the case had moved on to other matters. Then, on the 8th of April, 1964, the river spoke again. She was found on the foreshore of the Thames at Corney Reach, Chiswick, not far from where Hannah Tailford had been discovered. She was lying face down in the mud, naked, her body marked with the same terrible simplicity that had characterized the earlier killing. She had been strangled. She had been stripped. And she was pregnant. Her name was Irene Lockwood, and she was 26 years old. She had been born in Nottinghamshire and had come to London by the same route that so many others had taken. The route that led from a place with too little to a place with too much, and that ended, for women like Irene, on the same streets and in the same cars and in the same rooms where the transaction was always the same. She was blonde and slight, standing no more than 5 feet tall, the kind of woman who could be overpowered without difficulty by a man of average strength. She worked the same areas as Hannah Tailford, along the Bayswater Road and in the surrounding streets of West London, and she lived in accommodation that was shared with other women in the same trade. Her flatmate had been battered to death just a few months before Irene's own murder, a detail that speaks to the level of violence that permeated the world in which these women lived. Violence was not exceptional. It was constant. It was the weather of the streets, always present, sometimes distant, sometimes close, and always capable of turning lethal without warning. The police established that Irene Lockwood had been assaulted and strangled at a location other than where her body was found, and that she had been transported to the river and left on the foreshore, presumably under cover of darkness. The parallels with the death of Hannah Tailford were now impossible to ignore. 2 women, both prostitutes, both working the same area, both found naked on the banks of the Thames within a few hundred yards of each other, both strangled, both stripped. The Metropolitan Police, with some reluctance, acknowledged what had become obvious to anyone who cared to look. A serial killer was operating in the western suburbs of London. The press, which had paid little attention to the death of Hannah Tailford, now began to take notice. The discovery of a second naked body on the same stretch of river was the kind of story that sold newspapers, and the editors of Fleet Street knew their readership well enough to understand that a killer who targeted prostitutes in London would generate the same kind of fascinated horror that Jack the Ripper had generated 76 years earlier. The comparison was inevitable, and it was made almost immediately. The newspapers began referring to the unknown killer as Jack the Stripper, a name that was both a reference to the Ripper and a crude description of the killer's apparent habit of removing his victims' clothing. The name stuck, as such names always do, and it would follow the case through the decades that followed, long after the last body had been found and the last detective had retired. The police now linked the deaths of Tailford and Lockwood with the earlier murder of Elizabeth Figg in 1959, though the connection with Gwynneth Rees remained less certain due to differences in the disposal of the body. A task force was assembled, officers were assigned, and the machinery of a major murder investigation began to turn. But the machinery was slow, and the killer was not. In the midst of this investigation, an unexpected development occurred. On the 27th of April 1964, a 57-year-old caretaker named Kenneth Archibald walked into Notting Hill Police Station and voluntarily confessed to the murder of Irene Lockwood. Archibald was employed at the Holland Park Lawn Tennis Club, and he told the officers on duty that he had killed Lockwood in a moment of rage. He was charged with the murder and committed to stand trial at the Old Bailey. But when the case came before the court in June of that year, Archibald retracted his confession and entered a plea of not guilty. He told the jury that he had been suffering from depression and that his confession had been false, the product of a disturbed mind rather than a guilty conscience. There was no physical evidence to link him to the crime, no forensic material, no witness testimony, nothing beyond the words he himself had spoken in the interview room at Notting Hill. On the 23rd of June, 1964, the jury found Kenneth Archibald not guilty, and the judge, Mr. Justice Neild, ordered his acquittal. The false confession of Kenneth Archibald cost the investigation precious time and diverted resources away from the search for the real killer. It also revealed something about the psychological atmosphere that the killings had created in the area. Archibald was not a murderer. He was a lonely, troubled man who had been overwhelmed by the weight of the news that surrounded him, and had somehow convinced himself, or allowed others to convince him, that he was responsible for something he had not done. False confessions were not uncommon in high-profile murder cases. The pressure of public attention, the desire for resolution, and the peculiar workings of a mind under strain could produce admissions that bore no relationship to reality. But for the police, each false lead was a wound in the investigation, a loss of time and credibility that could not be recovered. By the end of April 1964, 2 women were confirmed dead by the same hand. A third killing from years earlier had been tentatively linked. A false confession had been made and withdrawn, and the killer remained entirely unknown. The press was calling him Jack the Stripper. The public was beginning to feel the first stirrings of fear, and the women of the streets, who had always known that their lives were cheap, now understood that they had become the prey of something systematic, something that would not stop on its own, and something that the police, for all their numbers and all their authority, had not yet come close to catching. The spring of 1964 turned towards summer. The days grew longer, and the fog that had wrapped the river through the winter months began to lift. But the darkness did not lift with it. Somewhere in the western suburbs, the killer was still moving, still watching, still choosing, and the next body was already on its way. Hadda. Chapter 4. The Paint and the Teeth. It was barely a fortnight after the discovery of Irene Lockwood when the third confirmed victim was found, and this time the river had nothing to do with it. The body was not on the foreshore, not tangled in the weeds of the towpath, not drifting in the grey current beneath the bridges of Chiswick. It was in an alleyway at the rear of 199 Boston Manor Road, Brentford, a residential street that backed onto the kind of modest terraced housing that characterised the western suburbs. The alleyway was narrow and unlit, the sort of passage that existed between the backs of houses and the walls of neighbouring properties, used by residents to reach their dustbins and by no one else. It was here, on the morning of the 24th of April 1964, that the body of Helen Barthelemy was discovered. She was 22 years old. She had been born in the east of Scotland, in East Lothian, and had come south to London with the same ambitions and the same lack of resources that had brought so many young women to the city before her. She had dreamed of something better than what she had left behind, and for a time, perhaps, the dream had sustained her. But London was an expensive city, and dreams without money behind them had a way of corroding into something unrecognisable. Helen Barthelemy had ended up on the streets of West London, working as a prostitute, and whatever she had imagined for herself when she first stepped off the train at Paddington or King's Cross, or whichever station had received her, had long since been replaced by the reality of cold corners and strange cars, and a nightly calculation of risk that every woman in her position was forced to make. She was naked when she was found. This was no longer a surprise to the officers who attended the scene. They had come to expect it. The killer, whoever he was, stripped his victims of their clothing with a thoroughness that went beyond any practical purpose. It was not simply that he removed their dresses and their coats. He removed everything, down to the last stitch, leaving nothing behind that might identify the woman or connect her to a particular place or a particular time. The stripping was part of the act, as deliberate and as ritualistic as the killing itself, though the word ritualistic was not one that the detectives of the Metropolitan Police would have used in 1964. They did not yet think in those terms. They thought in terms of evidence and motive and opportunity, and the evidence before them, while consistent with the earlier killings, also contained something new. Helen Barthelemy's front teeth were missing. Not all of them, but 4, removed with a force that had left fragments lodged in her throat. This detail, gruesome as it was the first clear indication that the killer had a signature beyond the stripping of the body. The removal of teeth was not incidental. It was not the result of a blow to the face during a struggle. It was deliberate, carried out either before or after death with a purpose that the investigators could not yet fathom. Was it a trophy? Was it a form of degradation? Was it connected in some way to the sexual element of the crime, to the act that preceded or accompanied the killing? The pathologists and the detectives debated these questions in the mortuaries and the incident rooms, but no consensus was reached. The teeth were gone, and the reason was gone with them, locked inside the mind of a man who had no intention of explaining himself. But it was not the missing teeth that would prove to be the most significant finding on Helen Barthelemy's body. It was something far smaller, something that could not be seen with the naked eye, and that required the careful work of forensic technicians operating in laboratories that smelled of chemical reagents and stale air. On the surface of her skin, scattered across her body in a pattern that was too even and too fine to have been caused by contact with a painted surface, were tiny flecks of paint. Industrial paint. The kind of paint that was used in motor vehicle manufacturing, applied not by hand with a brush but by machine, with a compressed air spray gun that produced a fine mist of pigment capable of settling on any surface within its reach. The flecks were minute, barely visible under magnification, but they were there, embedded in the pores of the skin, clinging to the fine hairs of the arms and the torso, and they told the forensic scientists something that no witness and no informant had been able to tell them. Helen Barthelemy's body had been in close proximity to a spray painting operation at some point between her death and her disposal. This was a breakthrough, and the detectives recognized it as such, though they were careful not to overstate its significance in the early days. The paint could have come from any number of sources. West London was home to dozens of small workshops and garages that repaired and resprayed motor vehicles, and the spray painting trade was not regulated in any way that would make it easy to trace a particular batch of paint to a particular shop. Nevertheless, the finding narrowed the field. The killer, or at least the place where the killer stored his victims between the act of killing and the act of disposal, was connected to the motor trade. He was a man who had access to a space where vehicles were painted, a workshop or a garage or a storage unit, that was close enough to a spray booth for the fine mist of paint to settle on a body that was kept there for a period of hours or days. The implications were significant. If the paint could be traced to a specific location, the police would have a geography to work with, a fixed point on the map around which the investigation could be organized. They would know where the killer kept his dead, and from that knowledge they might be able to determine who had access to that space, who worked there, who held the keys, who came and went after hours. The paint was a thread, and if they pulled it carefully enough, it might lead them to the man at the other end. The discovery of the paint flecks also altered the investigators' understanding of the killer's method. He was not, as they had initially supposed, a man who killed in the open and left his victims where they fell. He was a man who killed elsewhere, in a private space where he could not be seen or heard, and who then transported the bodies to the locations where they were found. This meant that he had access to a vehicle, something large enough to carry a body without attracting attention, a van or an estate car or a works vehicle of the kind that was common in the industrial areas of West London. It also meant that he stored the bodies for a period of time before disposing of them, a period during which the paint settled on the skin and the body began the slow process of deterioration that the pathologists would later document in their reports. The storage of the body was not incidental. It was part of the pattern, part of whatever dark logic governed the killer's behavior, and it suggested a level of planning and control that went beyond the opportunistic violence of a man who simply lost his temper with a woman on a dark street. The police began the laborious process of surveying every spray painting operation in the western suburbs of London. Officers were dispatched to garages and workshops across Hammersmith, Chiswick, Brentford, Acton and the surrounding areas, collecting samples of paint, noting the types of equipment in use, recording the names of employees and the hours of operation. It was painstaking work, the kind of investigation that consumed enormous quantities of manpower and produced vast amounts of data, most of which would prove irrelevant. But somewhere in that data the detectives believed was the answer. Somewhere in the ledgers and the work rosters and the paint supply invoices was a connection to the man who'd killed Helen Barthelemy and left her in an alleyway in Brentford with industrial paint on her skin and her teeth torn from her mouth. The press, meanwhile, was doing what the press does best. The story of the Nude Murders had now captured the attention of Fleet Street, and the newspapers competed with each other to produce the most sensational coverage. The name Jack the Stripper appeared in headlines across the country, and the comparison with Jack the Ripper was made repeatedly in editorials and features and letters to the editor that expressed a mixture of outrage and fascination. The public was gripped by the case in the way that the public is always gripped by cases involving sex and death and the failure of authority. There was something primal about the story, something that reached back through the centuries to the oldest fears of the city, the fear of the predator who moves unseen through the streets, who takes the weak and the unprotected, and who cannot be stopped by the forces of law and order. Jack the Ripper had embodied that fear in 1888. Jack the Stripper embodied it now, in 1964, and the parallels were too neat and too compelling for the press to resist. But the press attention, while it raised public awareness and put pressure on the police to produce results, also created problems. The killer was now aware that he was being hunted. If he read the newspapers, and there was no reason to suppose he did not, he knew that the police were looking for him, that they had found the paint on Helen Barthelymy's body, and that they were searching the garages and workshops of West London for the source. A more cautious killer might have stopped at this point, might have retreated into the anonymity of the suburbs and waited for the investigation to lose momentum. But this killer did not stop. Whether out of compulsion or confidence or contempt for the police, he continued to hunt, and the intervals between the killings were growing shorter. The pattern that was emerging from the forensic evidence told a story that the investigators were still learning to read. The victims were all women of the streets. They were all small in stature, slight of build, the kind of women who could be overpowered with relative ease. They were all strangled, though the precise method varied slightly from case to case, some by hand, some with a ligature, some possibly with their own clothing. They were all stripped of every article of clothing, a process that appeared to take place after death rather than before, and their bodies were stored for a period before being transported to the dump site. The missing teeth were a feature that had appeared in the earliest cases and would continue to appear in the later ones, a detail so specific and so consistent that it constituted a signature, a mark of authorship that connected the crimes as surely as a fingerprint. And there was one more detail that the investigators noted, a detail that was more difficult to discuss in the language of the 1960s than it would be today. There was no evidence of conventional sexual assault on any of the victims, no evidence of rape, no evidence of the kind of sexual violence that was typically associated with the murder of women by men. The absence of such evidence was itself a clue, though its meaning was debated. Some investigators believed that the sexual element of the crime was contained in the act of stripping, that the removal of the clothing was the gratification, and that the killing was the means by which the killer obtained the body in a state that allowed him to enact whatever private ritual he required. Others believed the sexual act occurred before the killing, in the course of the transaction that had brought the killer and his victim together in the first place, and that the killing was a method of silencing the witness. Still others speculated that the missing teeth were connected to a specific sexual act, a theory that gained some currency among the detectives, but that was never confirmed by the forensic evidence. What was certain was that the killer was escalating. The interval between the first and second confirmed killings had been 2 months. The interval between the second and third had been barely 2 weeks. Whatever restraint had governed his behaviour in the early stages of the sequence was weakening, and the hunger, if that is what it was growing. The detectives understood this. They understood that they were in a race, and that every day that passed without an arrest was a day in which another woman might be taken from the streets and added to the count. The summer of 1964 was approaching. The days would grow warm and the nights would shorten, and the women of the streets would be out later and in greater numbers, drawn by the weather and by the need that never relented. The police had their paint flecks and their pattern and their growing sense that the killer was local, that he lived and worked within the geography of the crimes, and that he knew the streets and the alleyways and the industrial estates of West London with the familiarity of a man who had walked them 1,000 times. But they did not have his name. They did not have his face. And the river, which had given them so much already, had nothing more to offer. The next body was only weeks away. Chapter 5. A Summer of Fear. The summer arrived as it always did in London, not with the sudden blaze of heat that marked the seasons in other latitudes, but with the slow warming that crept through the brickwork of the terraced houses and softened the tarmac on the roads and drew the smell of the river up from the foreshore into the streets above. The trees along the towpath at Chiswick put out their leaves in full, and the parks that lined the northern bank of the Thames filled in the evenings with families and couples and groups of young people who sat on the grass and listened to transistor radios and talked about the things that young people talked about in the summer of 1964. The Beatles were everywhere. The World Cup was 2 years away. Harold Wilson was promising a new Britain forged in the white heat of technology, and the country, or at least the part of it that read the newspapers and watched the television, believed him. It was a summer of confidence, of forward motion, of the feeling that the old world was receding and the new world was repising, and that the future, whatever it held, would be better than the past. But in the western suburbs, in the streets between Hammersmith and Acton, the confidence was thinner than it appeared. The women who worked the pavements after dark knew what the newspapers had told them, that a killer was loose among them, that 3 of their number had been found dead since February, and that the police, for all their efforts, had not caught him. The name Jack the Stripper had entered the common vocabulary of the streets, spoken not with the detached fascination of the newspaper reader, but with the intimate dread of those who understood that they were the prey. Some women changed their routines, avoiding the quieter streets, refusing to get into cars with men they did not recognize, staying close to the lit areas around the pubs and the all-night cafes. Others could not afford such caution. The rent was due, the children needed feeding, and the economy of the streets did not allow for the luxury of fear. They went out as they had always gone out, and they hoped, as they had always hoped, that the danger would pass them by and settle on someone else. The police had increased their presence in the area, deploying additional patrols along the Bayswater Road and through the streets of Notting Hill and Shepherd's Bush, where the women were known to congregate. Plainclothes officers moved through the nighttime crowds, watching, listening, noting the registration numbers of cars that slowed at the curb and the faces of the men who leaned across the passenger seat to speak through the open window. It was a massive operation by the standards of the time, consuming hundreds of man-hours each week and straining the resources of the local divisions that were responsible for the area. But the killer was not deterred. He had seen the police before, had lived alongside them, had perhaps even spoken to them in the course of their inquiries without arousing the slightest suspicion. He understood the limitations of their methods, understood that a man who did not draw attention to himself could move through a city of 8 million people without being noticed, and that the darkness of the western suburbs, for all the additional patrols and the additional streetlights, was still deep enough to conceal what needed to be concealed. The 14th of July, 1964. Bastille Day. Though no one in Chiswick was celebrating, the body was found in the early hours of the morning, not on the foreshore of the river this time, but on an open street, outside number 48 Berrymead Road, a quiet residential turning in the heart of the suburb. She was lying on the forecourt of a garage, naked, her body bearing the same marks that had become horribly familiar to the detectives who had attended the previous scenes. She had been strangled. Her tea had been removed, and on her skin, invisible to the eye but present under the lights of the forensic laboratory, were the same fine flecks of industrial spray paint that had been found on the body of Helen Barthelemy 3 months earlier. Her name was Mary Fleming, and she was 30 years old. She had been born in Scotland and had made her way to London by the same uncertain path that had brought so many of the other victims to the city. She was small, as the others had been small. She was slight, as the others had been slight. And she had been working the streets of West London, as the others had worked them, in the same territory, under the same conditions. with the same absence of protection that characterized the lives of every woman in her position. The details of her biography are sparser even than those of the women who preceded her, because Mary Fleming left fewer traces in the documentary record than Hannah Tailford or Irene Lockwood. She had no connection to the Profumo affair, no stories of underground parties, no classified advertisements offering unborn children to strangers. She was simply a woman who had lived quietly and died violently, and who would be remembered, if she was remembered at all, as a name on a list. The fourth confirmed victim of the man the newspapers called Jack the Stripper, that the circumstances of her discovery provided the investigation with something that the earlier cases had not. Neighbours on Berrymead Road reported hearing a vehicle in the street shortly before the body was found. Several residents recalled the sound of a car or a van reversing down the road in the darkness, the low growl of the engine and the crunch of the tyres on the tarmac, followed by silence, and then the sound of the vehicle pulling away. No one had looked out of a window. No one had gone to investigate. The sound of a vehicle in a residential street at night was not unusual enough to warrant attention, and in any case the darkness would have made it difficult to see anything of value. But the testimony confirmed what the forensic evidence had already suggested. The killer was transporting his victims in a vehicle, bringing them to the dump site under cover of darkness and leaving them where they would be found, as though the discovery was part of the design, as though the placement of the body in a public space was an element of the act that he could not omit. The fact that the body had been left on an open street rather than on the foreshore of the river or in a concealed alleyway was itself significant. The earlier victims had been found in locations that offered some degree of concealment, places where a body might lie undiscovered for hours or even days before being noticed. Mary Fleming had been left in plain view, on a residential street where she would inevitably be found as soon as daylight arrived. Whether this represented a change in the killer's behaviour, a growing confidence, a growing recklessness, or simply a practical adjustment to the increased police presence along the river, was a matter of debate among the investigators. Some believed that the killer was testing the limits of what he could do without being caught, pushing the boundaries of risk in the same way that he was pushing the boundaries of the interval between killings. Others believed that the change of location was forced upon him, that the heightened police patrols along the Thames had made the river too dangerous as a dump site, and that the killer had been compelled to find alternative locations. Either way, the geography of the case was expanding, and the detectives understood that the killer's territory, while still centred on the western suburbs, was not fixed. The paint flecks on Mary Fleming's body were consistent with those found on Helen Barthelemy, and the forensic scientists were now confident that the source was the same, a spray painting operation somewhere in the area that used a particular type of industrial pigment. The search for the source continued, with officers visiting workshop after workshop, garage after garage, collecting samples and comparing them with the material recovered from the bodies. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply frustrating because the number of potential sources was large and the resources available to the investigation, while substantial, were not unlimited. Each comparison required laboratory analysis, and each analysis took time, and with every day that passed, the pressure on the investigation grew, fed by the newspapers and by the public and by the families of the dead women who wanted answers that the police did not yet have. The press coverage had reached a pitch that was beginning to create its own problems. The name Jack the Stripper appeared in headlines almost daily, and the comparison with Jack the Ripper had moved beyond a convenient shorthand into something approaching an obsession. Feature writers and crime correspondents wrote lengthy articles exploring the parallels between the two cases, noting the similarities in the choice of victim, the method of killing, the concentration of the crimes in a specific area of London, and the failure of the police to identify the killer. The comparison was not always helpful to the investigation. It created an expectation of failure, a sense that the case was destined to remain unsolved because its predecessor had remained unsolved, and it placed the detectives under a kind of historical pressure that had nothing to do with the facts of the case before them. They were not hunting Jack the Ripper. They were hunting a man who lived in the western suburbs of London in 1964, who drove a vehicle, who had access to a spray painting shop, and who killed women of the streets with a method that was consistent and deliberate. He was not a phantom. He was not a legend. He was a man of flesh and blood who left traces of paint on his victims and who could be identified if the investigation was given sufficient time and sufficient resources. But time was the one thing the investigation did not have. The killer was accelerating. The interval between the first and second confirmed killings had been approximately 2 months. Between the second and third it had been barely 2 weeks. Between the 3rd and 4th, it had been just under 3 months, a pause that might have suggested a cooling of the impulse, but that the detectives interpreted with caution, knowing that a killer who had struck 3 times in rapid succession was unlikely to stop voluntarily. The question was not whether he would kill again, but when, and the answer, as the summer of 1964 deepened and the evenings grew long and warm, was that it would be soon. The women of the streets knew this. They discussed it among themselves, in the shared flats and the all-night cafes and the coffee stalls where they gathered between clients. They knew the names of the dead. Hannah, Harter, Irene, Helen, Mary. They were not strangers. They were colleagues, neighbours, acquaintances, women who had stood on the same corners and climbed into the same kinds of cars and shared the same understanding of the risks that attended their trade. The death of one was a warning to all, but it was a warning that could not be heeded without abandoning the only source of income that most of them had. The trap was perfect in its cruelty. The women could not stop working, and they could not work without exposing themselves to the man who was killing them, and the police could not protect them because they could not know which client on which night, in which car, was the one who would not bring them back. The summer wore on. The investigation continued. The patrols continued. The searches continued. And in the streets of West London, the women continued to walk, and the cars continued to slow at the curb, and the transactions continued to take place in the darkness, and the fear, which had become as familiar as the weather, settled into the routine of the nights like damp into old plaster, always present, never quite acknowledged, impossible to remove. The 5th victim would not be found until the autumn. The killer, for reasons known only to himself, allowed the summer to pass without adding to his tally. Perhaps the increased police presence had forced him to exercise a caution he did not naturally possess. Perhaps circumstances in his personal life, whatever that life consisted of, had intervened to prevent him from acting. Perhaps he was simply waiting, as the river waited, for the right moment and the right woman and the right convergence of darkness and opportunity. Whatever the reason, the pause lasted through July and August and September and into October, and when the killing resumed, it would take the investigation into territory that was darker and more complicated than anything that had come before. For one of the next victims would be a woman whose name had appeared in the newspapers, not as a murder victim but as a witness. A woman who had stood in the witness box at the Old Bailey and given testimony in one of the most sensational trials of the decade, and whose death would raise questions that reached far beyond the streets of West London and into the corridors of power, where the men who governed the nation conducted their private affairs behind closed doors. The autumn was coming. The leaves along the towpath at Chiswick were beginning to turn, and somewhere in the western suburbs the killer was watching and waiting and ready to begin again. Extab. Chapter 6. The Girl Who Knew Too Much. October in London. The light changed first, softening and retreating, drawing the evenings forward so that by 5 o'clock the street lamps were lit and the shadows stretched long across the pavements. The parks emptied earlier than they had in summer, and the river, which had glinted in the July sunshine, turned grey and opaque, its surface dimpled by the rain that fell with increasing frequency through the shortening days. The women of the streets adjusted their schedules accordingly, starting earlier, finishing later, wearing heavier coats that they would remove in the warmth of a car and put back on when the transaction was complete. The routine did not change with the seasons. Only the weather changed, and the darkness, which came sooner and stayed longer, and offered the killer more hours in which to do his work. She was last seen alive in October of 1964. The exact date is uncertain, as the movements of women in her profession were not tracked with the precision that the courts would later demand. But witnesses recalled seeing her in the area around Portobello Road and the streets of Notting Hill, where she was known and where she had worked for some time. On an evening that no one would later be able to pinpoint with certainty, she was observed getting into a car, a Ford Zodiac, driven by a man who was described as a client. She did not return. Her friends and associates noticed her absence, but they did not immediately raise the alarm, because absence, in the world of the streets, was not the same as disappearance. Women went away. They moved to other areas, stayed with men they had met, spent time in hospitals or police cells or the homes of relatives who still acknowledged them. The possibility of foul play was considered, but not assumed. And so the days passed, and the weeks passed, and the woman who had climbed into the Ford Zodiac did not come back. Her body was found on the 25th of November 1964, a full month after she had last been seen. It was discovered in a car park on Hornton Street, near Kensington High Street, a location that was notable for its distance from the other dump sites. All the previous victims had been found in the western suburbs, along the corridor that stretched from Hammersmith to Acton, in the territory where they had lived and worked, and where the killer appeared to be based. Horton Street was further east, closer to the centre of the city, in a part of London that was wealthier and more visible than the streets of Chiswick and Brentford. The choice of location suggested either that the killer was expanding his range, or that circumstances had compelled him to dispose of the body at a greater distance from his usual ground. Perhaps because the police presence in the western suburbs had made the familiar sights too risky. She was naked, as the others had been naked. She had been strangled, as the others had been strangled. One of her teeth had been torn from its socket, maintaining the grim pattern that had marked every victim since Helen Barthelemy. And on her skin, barely visible, were the same fine flecks of industrial spray paint that had become the forensic signature of the case. A gold ring was missing from her finger. A chain bearing a silver cross, which she had been known to wear, was also missing. These items were never recovered, and whether they had been taken as trophies by the killer or simply lost during the handling of the body was never established. Her name, the name she had been born with, was Margaret McGowan. But she had used another name in her working life, the name Frances Brown, and it was under this name that she had moved through the world of the streets and the clubs and the private parties that constituted the nocturnal economy of West London. The use of a working name was common among women in her profession, a small measure of separation between the life they lived after dark and whatever remained of the life they had lived before. But in the case of Margaret McGowan, the working name concealed something more than the ordinary desire for anonymity. It concealed a connection that reached beyond the streets of Notting Hill and into the heart of the most explosive political scandal of the decade. Margaret McGowan, under the name Frances Brown, had given evidence at the trial of Stephen Ward at the Old Bailey in the summer of 1963. Ward, the society osteopath and portrait artist who had introduced Christine Keeler to John Profumo, had been charged with living off the earnings of prostitution, and the prosecution had called a number of women to testify about their relationships with him and about the transactions that had taken place under his roof and in his social circle. Frances Brown was one of these witnesses. She had told the court that she had been introduced to Ward and that she had been paid by him to attend gatherings and to provide companionship to men of wealth and influence. Her testimony was a small piece of a much larger puzzle, but it placed her inside a world where the boundaries between politics and sex and money were blurred beyond recognition and where the consequences of knowing too much could be severe. The Profumo affair had destroyed careers and reputations and had contributed to the fall of a government. Stephen Ward had taken his own life rather than face the verdict. Christine Keeler had been convicted of perjury and sent to prison. Mandy Rice Davies had left the country. The men who had attended the parties and used the services that Ward had provided had retreated behind their titles and their solicitors and their connections, and the machinery of the establishment had closed around them like a fist. The women who had been involved, the call girls and the party girls and the street women who had drifted through Ward's orbit, were left to their own devices, unprotected by the system that had used them and discarded by the individuals who had paid for their company. Some returned to the streets. Some found other ways to survive. And at least two of them, according to the writer Anthony Summers, ended up dead on the banks of the Thames or in the alleyways of West London, their bodies stripped and their teeth missing, and their connection to the scandal of the century noted but never investigated. The question that hung over Margaret McGowan's death, unspoken in the official files but whispered in the pubs and the newsrooms and the corridors of Scotland Yard, was whether her killing was connected to what she knew. Had she been targeted because of her association with the Profumo circle? Had she possessed knowledge that someone wished to suppress? Was the man who killed her acting on his own impulse, selecting his victims from the streets without regard to their histories, or was he acting on behalf of interests that preferred certain witnesses to remain silent? The questions were tantalizing, and they would fuel conspiracy theories for decades to come. But the evidence to support them was thin. Margaret McGowan fit the profile of the other victims perfectly. She was a woman of the streets. She was small in stature. She was working in the same area. She was killed in the same manner, strangled and stripped and stored and discarded with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized every killing in the sequence. The simplest explanation was that she had been selected not because of who she was, but because of what she was. Another vulnerable woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another body added to the count by a killer who did not know or care about the Profumo affair, or the trial of Stephen Ward, or the private lives of cabinet ministers. but the simplest explanation is not always the most satisfying, and the death of Margaret McGowan ensured that the case of Jack the Stripper would never be regarded as a straightforward series of murders. It would always carry with it the shadow of conspiracy, the suggestion that the killings were connected to something larger and darker than the pathology of a single individual, and that the failure to solve the case was not merely a failure of police, but a deliberate act of suppression by forces that had the power to prevent the truth from emerging. This suggestion was never proven. It was never disproven either. It simply lingered, like the fog that hung over the river on cold mornings, obscuring the view and refusing to lift. The police, for their part, treated the death of Margaret McGowan as they had treated the deaths of the other victims, as the work of the same killer operating within the same pattern. The paint flecks confirmed the connection. The missing tooth confirmed the connection. The stripping of the body confirmed the connection. Chief Superintendent John G. Rose, who had been brought in to lead the investigation earlier that year, added the file to the growing stack on his desk and continued the work of narrowing the field. The spray painting shops of West London were still being surveyed. The registration numbers of vehicles seen in the area were still being checked. The women of the streets were still being interviewed, though their willingness to cooperate with the police remained limited by the same mistrust that had always governed the relationship between the law and those who lived beyond its protection. The investigation was now 9 months old, counting from the discovery of Hannah Tailford in February. 5 women were confirmed dead, and 2 earlier cases had been tentatively linked to the same killer. The press coverage had not diminished. The public anxiety had not diminished. The pressure on Scotland Yard had not diminished. And the killer, who had waited through the summer before striking again, had demonstrated that neither the passage of time nor the weight of the investigation was sufficient to prevent him from continuing his work. The month between Margaret McGowan's disappearance in October and the discovery of her body in November raised a question that the investigators had confronted before, but that now demanded a more urgent answer. Where had the body been during those missing weeks? The forensic evidence suggested that she had been dead for a considerable period before her body was placed in the car park on Hornsey Street, and the paint flecks on her skin confirmed that she had been stored in the same location, or a location of the same type as the previous victims. The killer had a space that was secure and private and accessible to him at all hours, where he could keep the bodies of his victims for days or weeks before disposing of them. Finding that space had become the central objective of the investigation, the point toward which all the paint samples and vehicle checks and witness statements were directed. If the police could find the storage location, they could find the killer, and if they could find the killer, the killing would stop. But the killing had not stopped yet. The autumn deepened into winter, and the streets of West London grew cold and dark, and the women who walked them pulled their coats tighter against the wind and watched the headlights of approaching cars with an attention that was sharper than it had been a year ago, and the city, which had been swinging so confidently a few months earlier, now carried a weight that no amount of musical fashion or political rhetoric could lift. 5 women were dead. The killer was free, and the river, which had given up so many of its secrets, kept flowing toward the sea, indifferent to the names of the dead and the questions of the living. Christmas came and went. The new year arrived, 1965, and with it, the final act. Chapter 7. Bridie. The winter of 1965 settled over London with a particular heaviness. The fog, which had been a feature of the city's climate for centuries, rolled in from the Thames and hung in the streets for days at a time, thick enough to muffle sound and reduce visibility to a few yards. The old hands said it was not as bad as the Great Smog of 1952, which had killed thousands and turned the city into a grey tomb for 4 December days, but it was bad enough to make the street lamps blurry and the alleyways invisible, and the sound of footsteps on the pavement seem closer than they were. In the western suburbs the fog was particularly dense, clinging to the industrial estates and the trading yards and the stretches of waste ground that bordered the railway lines. It was the kind of weather that a man could disappear into, and the kind of weather in which a woman could vanish without anyone seeing her go. Her name was Bridget O'Hara, though everyone who knew her called her Bridie. She was 28 years old, and she had come to London from Dublin, crossing the Irish Sea with whatever hopes and expectations a young Irishwoman carried with her to the capital of the country that had governed her own for 700 years. Ireland in the 1950s and early 1960s was a country of emigration, a country where the economy offered too little and the church demanded too much, and where the young left in numbers that emptied entire parishes and turned the ports of Dunlawhere and Cobe into places of perpetual farewell. Bridget O'Hara was one of the thousands who made the crossing, and like many of them, she found that London, while larger and louder and more anonymous than anything she had known in Dublin, was not necessarily kinder. She had struggled to establish herself. The details of her early years in the city are scarce, but the trajectory is familiar. She had not found the steady employment or the stable home that she might have imagined when she left Ireland. She had drifted into the nightlife of the western suburbs, into the world of the pubs and the clubs, and the streets where money could be earned after dark by women who had no other means of earning it. She had become a prostitute, working the same areas as the women who had preceded her into death, walking the same pavements, standing beneath the same lampposts, climbing into the same cloths, climbing into the same cars. She was known to the other women on the street and to the police officers who patrolled the area, a familiar face in a world where faces came and went with the regularity of the tide. Bridget O'Hara was last seen on the 11th of January, 1965. She was reported missing shortly afterward. That the reporting of a missing prostitute in 1965 London was not the urgent high-priority event that the disappearance of a woman from a more conventional background would have been. The police noted her absence, made inquiries among the other women of the streets, and waited. They had learned over the course of the previous year that the killer stored his victims for a period between the act of killing and the act of disposal, and they understood that Bridget O'Hara might already be dead, even as they searched for her among the living. The wait was not long, but it was long enough. 5 weeks passed. 5 weeks during which Bridget O'Hara's body lay somewhere in the western suburbs, hidden from the eyes of the police and the public, stored in a place that no one had yet found, undergoing a transformation that the investigators could not have predicted. On the morning of the 16th of February 1965, an electrician was making his way to work at the Heron Trading Estate in Acton. The estate was a sprawl of low industrial buildings, workshops and storage sheds that occupied a tract of land behind a residential area in the western suburbs. It was the kind of place that was busy during the day, when the small businesses that occupied the units were operating, and deserted at night, when the gates were locked and the premises were left in the care of a handful of security guards who made their rounds with torches and flasks of tea. The electrician was walking through the estate at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, making his way to his place of work in the early morning darkness, when something caught his eye. In a patch of rough ground beside a storage shed, partially concealed by bracken and dead grass, he saw a flash of colour that did not belong to the winter landscape. It was red, bright red, the colour of nail varnish on the toenails of a woman's bare foot. He stopped. He looked again, and then he saw the rest of her, lying in the bracken like something that had been discarded rather than placed. A body stripped of every article of clothing, the skin grey and strangely taut, the limbs arranged in the disordered posture of a figure that had been carried and dropped rather than gently laid down. He did not touch her. He turned and walked quickly to the nearest telephone and called the police. The officers who arrived at the Heron Trading Estate that February morning found a crime scene that was both familiar and new. Familiar because the body bore all the marks that had by now become the signature of Jack the Stripper. She was naked. She had been strangled. Her teeth had been removed, and on her skin, barely visible in the dawn light but unmistakable under the lights of the forensic laboratory, were the fine flecks of industrial spray paint that had connected every victim since Helen Barthelemy. But new because the condition of the body was unlike anything the investigators had seen before. Bridget O'Hara's skin was not merely pale with the pallor of death. It was partially mummified, the surface dried and tightened in a manner that suggested prolonged exposure to heat. The pathologists who examined her concluded that the body had been stored in a location where the temperature was significantly higher than the ambient temperature of the January air, a space that was heated either deliberately or as a byproduct of some industrial process. This finding was the key that the investigation had been seeking for almost a year. If the body had been kept somewhere warm, somewhere within the geography of the industrial estates that stretched through the western suburbs, then the storage location could be identified by its heat source. The police had already been searching the area for the source of the spray paint. Now they had a second parameter to narrow the search. They were looking for a place that was warm, that was associated with spray painting, and that was accessible to someone who could bring a body there under cover of darkness without being observed. The Heron Trading Estate itself, where the body had been found, became the immediate focus of the investigation. And it did not take long. Just a few yards from where Bridget O'Hara's body had been discovered, behind a building on the estate, the the police found what they have been looking for. It was a storage space, a lockup of the kind that was used by the small businesses on the estate to store equipment and materials. Behind the lockup, concealed from casual view, was a transformer, an electrical unit that generated a significant amount of heat as a byproduct of its operation. The space beneath and around the transformer was warm, consistently warm enough to partially mummify a body that was left there for a period of weeks. And on the surfaces around the transformer, on the walls, on the floor, on the underside of the unit itself, the forensic scientists found paint. Industrial spray paint. The same pigment, applied by the same type of equipment, that had been found on the bodies of Helen Barthelemy, Mary Fleming, Frances Brown, and now Bridget O'Hara. Directly opposite the lockup, facing it across a narrow yard, was a spray painting shop. The shop serviced motor vehicles, respraying damaged panels and applying fresh coats of paint to cars and vans that had been brought in for repair. The paint was applied with compressed air guns that produced a fine mist of pigment, and this mist, carried by the air currents within the workshop and the yard outside, settled on every surface within reach, including, as it now became clear, the bodies of women who had been stored in the lockup behind the building, where the heat of the transformer kept them warm and the paint drifted over them like dust. The police had found the killer's workshop. Not his home, not his identity, but the place where he had kept his victims between the act of murder and the act of disposal. It was a discovery of immense significance, because it fixed the geography of the case with a precision that had not been possible before. The killer was not simply a man who operated in the western suburbs. He was a man who had specific access to the Heron trading estate, who knew the layout of the buildings and the location of the lockup and the schedule of the security guards, and who could come and go in the hours of darkness without being challenged. The pool of potential suspects, which had been vast and amorphous, was suddenly much smaller. The detectives could now focus their attention on the men who worked on the estate, who had keys to the buildings, who drove vehicles that could be used to transport a body, and who had been present during the periods when the victims were known to have been stored there. The investigation entered its most intensive phase. Officers from Scotland Yard descended on the Heron trading estate and the surrounding area, interviewing every employee, every tenant, every security guard, every delivery driver, every person who had any connection to the premises. The records of the businesses on the estate were examined. The employment histories of every worker were checked. The vehicles associated with the estate were logged and their movements traced. It was an enormous undertaking involving hundreds of officers and thousands of interviews, and it generated a mountain of paperwork that would take months to process. But the detectives believed they were close. For the first time in the investigation, they had a fixed point, a location that the killer had used repeatedly and that he could not easily abandon. If they worked through the list of men who had access to the estate with sufficient thoroughness, they would find him. The discovery of the storage location also explained something that had puzzled the investigators from the beginning. The intervals between the killings were not random. They were governed by the killer's need to store the body and then dispose of it, and the storage period varied depending on circumstances that only the killer could fully understand. Sometimes the body was kept for a few days. Sometimes it was kept for weeks. The storage was not a convenience but a necessity, part of the killer's method, and the heat of the transformer and the drift of the paint were the byproducts of a process that had been repeated at least 4 times, perhaps more. But even as the investigation closed in on the Heron trading estate, the detectives faced a problem that was becoming increasingly urgent. The killer knew he was being hunted. The press coverage had been relentless. The police presence in the western suburbs had been visible and sustained, and now, with officers swarming over the industrial estate and interviewing every person connected to it, the killer could not have failed to understand that the net was tightening. He had 2 choices. He could continue to kill, accepting the increasing risk of detection, or he could stop, retreating into the anonymity of the suburbs and waiting for the investigation to lose momentum. The detectives hoped he would choose the former, because a killer who continued to operate was a killer who continued to leave traces, and traces could be followed to their source. A killer who stopped was a killer who became invisible, indistinguishable from the millions of ordinary men who lived and worked in the western suburbs and who had never harmed anyone. The weeks passed. No more bodies were found. The women of the streets who had lived under the shadow of the stripper for more than a year noticed the change. The fear did not lift immediately, because fear that has been lived with for so long does not vanish overnight. But But the nights grew quieter, and the headlines grew smaller, and the sense of immediate danger began to recede, replaced by a wary, uncertain relief that no one quite trusted. Had he stopped? Had he been frightened off by the investigation? Had he moved to another area, another city, another country? Or was he simply waiting, as he had waited before, for the attention to fade and the patrols to thin and the opportunity to present itself again? The answer, when it came, would not come from the streets or the river or the industrial estates. It would come from a garage in a quiet residential area, from a man who was found dead behind the wheel of his car with the engine running and a note beside him that would be read and reread and debated for decades to come. The fog was lifting, but the darkness was far from over. Chapter 8. The Detective and the Bluff. He arrived in the manner of a man who had been summoned to resolve what others had failed to resolve, and in truth, that is precisely what he was. Chief Superintendent John Rose of Scotland Yard was not a detective who had grown up in the local divisions of West London, working his way through the ranks of the Hammersmith or Chiswick stations, learning the geography of the streets and the rhythms of the community, over years of patient, unspectacular service. He was a man from the centre, from the upper echelons of the Criminal Investigation Department, a figure of considerable reputation who had earned himself a nickname among his colleagues that spoke to the quality that defined his career above all others. They called him 4-Day Johnny because it was said that he could solve a murder in 4 days. The name was partly admiring and partly sardonic, as such names always are in institutions where competence is respected, but self-promotion is viewed with suspicion. But there was no denying that John Rose had a record. He had closed cases that others had left open. He had identified killers that others had failed to find. And when the Hammersmith Nude Murders had persisted beyond the capacity of the local divisions to manage, it was Rose who was brought in to take command of the investigation and to deliver the result that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, the Home Secretary, and the press were all demanding with increasing impatience. Rose took over the case at a point when the investigation had already accumulated a vast quantity of material. Thousands of statements had been taken. Hundreds of vehicles had been checked. The spray painting shops of the western suburbs had been surveyed and sampled. The forensic evidence, particularly the paint flecks, had been analysed and catalogued. The files on each victim had been compiled with the meticulous detail that the Metropolitan Police brought to its major investigations, and the connections between the cases, the stripping, the strangulation, the missing teeth, the paint, the strangulation, the sphenics, the paint, the storage of the bodies, had been established beyond reasonable doubt. What was missing was the identity of the killer. The investigation had drawn a circle around a geography, around a method, around a type, but the man at the centre of that circle remained unnamed, unfaced, and unknown. Rose approached the problem with the systematic rigour that had earned him his reputation. He ordered a comprehensive review of every piece of evidence that had been gathered since the discovery of Hannah Tailford in February of 1964. He reorganised the incident room, consolidating the separate files from the different divisions into a single, unified archive that could be cross-referenced and searched. He assigned teams of officers to specific lines of inquiry, each team responsible for a different aspect of the case. The paint, the vehicles, the victims' movements, the witnesses, the alibis of potential suspects. And he began the process of narrowing the field, working from the outside in, eliminating categories of men who could not have committed the crimes, and focusing on those who could. The logic was straightforward, even if the execution was painstaking. The killer was a man who had access to the Heron trading estate in Acton, or to a similar industrial site in the immediate vicinity. He had access to a vehicle large enough to transport a body. He worked at night, or had the freedom to move about at night without arousing suspicion. He was familiar with the streets of West London, with the places where women of the streets worked, and with the quiet locations where a body could be left without immediate discovery. He was physically capable of overpowering a woman, though the small stature of the victim suggested that exceptional strength was not required. And he had continued to operate over a period of more than a year, which meant that he was local, settled, and unlikely to have moved away from the area during the period of the killings. Rose's team compiled a list of men who met these criteria. The list was long, numbering in the thousands, because the western suburbs of London were home to a large population of men who worked in the industrial trades, who drove vans and lorries, and who had reason to be out and about after dark. The task of reducing this list to a manageable number of genuine suspects required the kind of methodical, door-to-door investigation that consumed enormous quantities of time and manpower. Officers visited factories and workshops and trading estates across the area, checking employment records, verifying addresses, noting the names of men who had access to spray painting equipment, or who worked night shifts or who had any connection, however tenuous, to the locations where the bodies had been found. Duroz interviewed nearly 7,000 men in the course of the investigation. 7,000. The number is worth pausing over because it gives some indication of the scale of the operation and the determination with which it was pursued. Each interview required preparation, execution, and follow-up. Each man's account had to be checked against the known facts of the case, against the dates and times of the killings, against the locations of the dump sites, against the records of the businesses on the Heron trading estate. The vast majority of these men were eliminated quickly, their alibis confirmed, their movements accounted for, their connection to the case dismissed as coincidental or non-existent. But the process of elimination was itself valuable, because with each name that was crossed off the list, the pool of remaining suspects grew smaller, and the pressure on the man who had not yet been identified grew correspondingly greater. It was at this point that Duroz made the decision that would define the investigation in the eyes of the public and the press, and that would be debated by criminologists and crime writers for decades to come. He decided to bluff. The logic behind the bluff was simple. The killer, Duroz reasoned, was almost certainly aware of the investigation. He read the newspapers. He saw the police cars in his neighbourhood. He may even have been interviewed by the officers who were working their way through the list of 7,000 names. He knew that the net was closing even if he did not know how close it was. If Duroz could convince the killer that the investigation was further advanced than it actually was, that the suspect pool had been narrowed to a small number of men, and that an arrest was imminent, then the killer might react in one of two ways. He might flee, in which case his sudden departure from the area would draw attention and might lead to his identification. Or he might stop killing, in which case the immediate threat to the women of the streets would be removed, even if the case remained unsolved. Either outcome was preferable to the status quo, in which the killer continued to operate with impunity, while the investigation ground forward at a pace that the dead could not afford. Duroz called a press conference. He stood before the assembled journalists of Fleet Street, the crime correspondents and the feature writers and the photographers who had been covering the case since the name Jack the Stripper had first appeared in their headlines, and he made an announcement that was designed to be reported as widely and as prominently as possible. He told the press that the police had narrowed the suspect pool to 20 men. 20. Not 7,000. Not several hundred. 20. The investigation, he implied, was in its final stages. An arrest was expected soon. The stripper's days of freedom were numbered. The announcement was reported across every major newspaper in the country. The headlines were confident, even triumphant. Scotland Yard was closing in. The killer would be caught. The women of West London could breathe again. Duroz allowed a short period to pass, long enough for the news to circulate and for the impact to be felt, and then he called another press conference. The suspect pool, he announced, had been further reduced. It was now 10. 10 men, any one of whom might be the stripper, and the detectives were working around the clock to identify which of the 10 was responsible. The headlines intensified. The pressure on the unknown killer, wherever he was, must have been immense. A few more weeks passed, and Duroz spoke to the press again. The suspect pool, he said, was now down to 3. 3 men. The investigation was on the verge of a breakthrough. The stripper would be identified, arrested, and brought to justice. The city waited. The press waited. The women of the streets waited. And the killer, if he was listening, waited too. The bluff worked, in the sense that the killings stopped. After the discovery of Bridget O'Hara in February of 1965, there were no further murders that matched the pattern of the Hammersmith Nude cases. Whether the cessation was caused by Duroz's press conferences, by the increased police presence on the Heron trading estate, by some change in the killer's personal circumstances, or by some other factor entirely, was and remains a matter of speculation. But the fact was that the killing stopped, and it did not resume. The women of West London were no longer being harvested from the streets and left naked in alleyways and on industrial estates. Whatever the reason, the stripper had retired from his work. But the bluff had a cost. By announcing publicly that the suspect pool had been narrowed to 20, then 10, then 3, Duroz had created an expectation of resolution that he could not fulfill. The press and the public expected an arrest. They expected a name, a face, a trial, a conviction. They expected the kind of definitive conclusion that the criminal justice system was designed to provide and that the narrative of the case seemed to demand. When no arrest came, when no name was announced, when the investigation continued to grind forward without producing the result that had been promised, the credibility of the Metropolitan Police suffered. The press, which had eagerly reported Durose's announcements, now began to question whether the announcements had been genuine or whether they had been a stratagem, a manipulation of public expectation designed to produce a result that could not be achieved through conventional detective work. The answer, of course, was that they had been exactly that. But the acknowledgement of the bluff, when it came, did not enhance the reputation of the man who devised it. Durose himself remained convinced that he knew who the killer was. In his later writings and in interviews that he gave after his retirement, he spoke with quiet confidence about the case and about the man he believed to be responsible. He referred to this man not by name, but by a pseudonym, calling him Big John. And he described him as a respectable married man in his 40s, a man whose occupation gave him access to the Heron trading estate, and whose personal circumstances afforded him the freedom to move about at night without arousing the suspicion of his family or his neighbours. Durose stated that the investigation had identified this man as the prime suspect shortly after the discovery of Bridget O'Hara, and that the weight of the circumstantial evidence against him was substantial, though not sufficient to secure a conviction in a court of law. The man, Durose said, had committed suicide before an arrest could be made, and with his death, the possibility of a criminal prosecution had died as well. The statement was carefully worded, as befitted a man who had spent his career navigating the intersection of evidence and discretion. Durose did not name his suspect. He did not provide the details of the evidence against him. He did not explain why, if the suspect had been identified before his death, no arrest had been attempted. He simply stated his belief, offered it to the public as the nearest thing to a resolution that the case would ever produce, and left it to others to judge whether his belief was justified. The announcement raised more questions than it answered. Who was Big John? Why had he not been arrested? Was the evidence against him as strong as Durose implied? Or had Durose, facing the end of his career and the prospect of being remembered as the detective who failed to catch the stripper, simply chosen to pin the blame on a dead man who could not defend himself? The questions multiplied with each passing year, and the answers, when they came, would prove as troubling as the questions themselves. The investigation did not end with Durose's retirement. It continued, in diminished form, through the late 1960s and into the 70s, as new leads were pursued and old ones were re-examined. But the momentum had been lost. The files grew dusty. The officers who had worked the case moved on to other assignments or retired from the force, and the name Jack the Stripper, which had once commanded the front pages of every newspaper in the country, faded from the public consciousness, replaced by new scandals and new crimes and new names that the press could use to sell its product. The bluff had stopped the killing, but it had not caught the killer, and the distinction between those two outcomes would haunt the case for the rest of its history. Chapter 9. The Dead Man's Note. The garage was ordinary. That is the first thing that must be said about it, because the ordinariness of the setting is essential to understanding the strangeness of what happened there. It was a residential garage, the kind that stood at the end of a short driveway behind a terraced house in the suburbs, a brick structure with a single door that opened onto a quiet street where the neighbours parked their cars and the milkman made his deliveries in the early hours, and where nothing of any consequence had ever happened before. It was the kind of place that existed in thousands of identical forms across the western suburbs of London, unremarkable, unnoticed, and utterly forgettable. And it was here, on the 3rd of March, 1965, barely 2 weeks after the discovery of Bridget O'Hara on the Heron trading estate, that the man whom John Durose would later call Big John was found dead. His name was Mungo Ireland. He was 45 years old, a Scotsman whose family roots lay in Dundee, where his paternal grandparents Mungo Brodie Ireland and Mary Jane Ireland had lived, and where his father David had married Anne Johnstone at St. Roch's Church in 1904. Mungo Ireland had been born on the 17th of April 1919 at 48 Crescent Lane, one of 8 siblings in a family that the records describe without elaboration. He had come south at some point in his adult life, as so many Scots did, drawn by the employment opportunities that London offered and by the anonymity that a city of 8 million could provide. He had married, fathered 5 children and settled in Putney in the southwestern suburbs of the city, living a life that was, by all outward appearances, entirely conventional. He had worked as a security guard on the Heron trading estate. The detail is important, because it was this connection, above all others, that placed him within the circle of suspicion that Rose had drawn around the case. As a security guard, Ireland had access to the estate after hours. He knew the layout of the buildings, the location of the storage sheds, the schedule of the other guards, and the blind spots where a man could move without being observed. He had keys. He had the freedom to come and go during the night shifts that the job required, and he was present on the estate during the period when at least some of the victims were believed to have been stored in the lockup behind the spray painting shop, where the heat of the transformer kept the air warm and the fine mist of paint settled on every surface within reach. Ireland had been identified as a person of interest in the investigation, following the discovery of Bridget O'Hara and the forensic examination of the Heron trading estate. The paint match, the proximity of the lockup to the spray shop, and Ireland's access to the premises had brought him to the attention of the detectives, who had added his name to the shrinking list of potential suspects. Whether Ireland was formally interviewed before his death is unclear from the available records. What is clear is that he was aware of the investigation, aware that the police were focusing on the Heron estate, and aware, through the press coverage that had accompanied Rose's announcements, that the suspects' pool was being narrowed and that an arrest might be imminent. On the morning of the 3rd of March 1965, Mungo Ireland was found dead in his car inside his garage. The engine was running. The garage door was closed. The cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning, the odourless gas that is produced by the combustion of petrol and that, in an enclosed space, displaces the oxygen in the air and causes death by asphyxiation within minutes. It was a method of suicide that was well known in the 1960s, a time before catalytic converters reduced the carbon monoxide content of exhaust fumes, and it was a method that left no room for ambiguity. Ireland had parked his car in the garage, closed the door, started the engine, and sat in the driver's seat until the gas overcame him. It was deliberate. It was final. And it was accompanied by a note. The note was addressed to his wife. It was short, and its wording has been reported in slightly different forms by different sources, but the essential content is consistent across all accounts. It read, in part, "I cannot stick it any longer," and it concluded with a postscript. "To save you and the police looking for me, I will be in the garage." The note also contained the phrase, "It may be my fault, but not all of it." The words were ambiguous, and their ambiguity would fuel debate for decades. What could he not stick any longer? The pressure of the investigation? The weight of guilt? The strain of a marriage that, according to some accounts, was in difficulty? The prospect of appearing before the Acton Magistrates' Court, where he was due that very morning to face a charge of failing to stop his vehicle after being involved in a road traffic accident? The note did not say. It offered a fragment of explanation and withheld the rest, leaving the reader to construct a narrative from the available clues, none of which pointed in a single direction with sufficient force to exclude the others. Rose seized upon the suicide as confirmation of his theory. In his book, published after his retirement, he wrote that the weight of the investigation had driven the killer to take his own life, and that the police had done everything in their power to bring the case to a conclusion, but had been thwarted by the suspect's death. He stated with characteristic care that because the man had never been arrested or stood trial, he must be considered innocent and would therefore never be named. The naming would come later, through the work of other writers and researchers who pieced together the identity of Big John from the clues that Rose had left in his accounts and from the records that were accessible to determined investigators. David Seabrook, in his book Jack of Jumps, published in 2006, was the first to publicly identify the suspect as Mungo Ireland, and his identification was based on extensive research into the original police files to which he had been granted unprecedented access. But Seabrook did not merely identify Ireland. He challenged Rose's contusion. Seabrook argued that the evidence against Ireland was thin, far thinner than Rose had implied, and that Rose had implied, and that Rose had, in effect, framed a dead man in order to claim credit for solving a case that remained, in truth, unsolved. Seabrook pointed to several facts that undermined the case against Ireland. First, Ireland had worked as a security guard on the Heron trading estate for only 3 weeks, a period that was far shorter than the span of the killings and that raised questions about his familiarity with the premises. Second, there was no forensic evidence linking Ireland to the crimes. No blood, no fibres, no traces of paint in his car or his home or on his clothing. Third, and most significantly, Seabrook presented evidence suggesting that Ireland had been in Scotland at the time of Bridget O'Hara's disappearance on the 11th of January 1965, a finding that, if correct, would eliminate him from consideration as the killer of at least one of the victims. The case against Ireland was further weakened by the circumstances of his suicide. If Ireland had been a guilty man, driven to self-destruction by the knowledge that the police were closing in, one might expect to find some trace of his crimes in his personal effects, in his vehicle, in his home, or in the spaces to which he had access. No such traces were found. The police searched his property after his death and discovered nothing that connected him to the murders. No clothing belonging to any of the victims, no teeth, no jewellery, no photographs, no trophies of any kind. The absence of evidence was not, of course, proof of innocence. A careful killer might have disposed of such items long before the investigation reached his door. But the absence was noted, and it added to the growing doubt that surrounded Durose's conclusion. There was also the matter of the suicide note itself. The phrase "to save you and the police looking for me" was interpreted by Durose and his supporters as a confession, an acknowledgement that the police were searching for him in connection with the murders, and that he was choosing death over arrest. But there was an alternative reading, one that was less dramatic but no less plausible. Ireland was due in court that morning on a motoring charge. He had failed to stop his vehicle after a minor road accident, an offence that carried a fine and possible disqualification from driving. For a man who was already under strain, whose marriage was in difficulty, and who may have been struggling with depression or anxiety, the prospect of a court appearance, however trivial, might have been sufficient to tip the balance. The note could be read as the last words of a man who was overwhelmed by the accumulation of small pressures, rather than the confession of a serial killer who had been cornered by the law. Durose did not live long enough to see his conclusion fully dismantled. He died believing, or at least claiming to believe, that Mungo Ireland was the stripper, and that the case, one never formally closed, had been effectively resolved by the suspect's death. But the doubts that Seabrook and others raised did not dissipate. They grew, fed by new research and new theories and new names that were added to the list of potential suspects with each passing decade. The Scotland Yard Serious Crime Review Group re-examined the case between 2006 and 2007, bringing modern investigative techniques to bear on a case that had been dormant for more than 40 years. The review concluded, in a statement that was carefully worded and diplomatically phrased, that the circumstantial evidence against Mungo Ireland was very strong, and that it was the view of the officers conducting the review that he was most likely responsible for the murders. The statement stopped short of a definitive conclusion, acknowledging that no physical evidence linked Ireland to the crimes, and that the case remained, technically, unsolved. But it lent the weight of institutional authority to Durose's original assessment, and it provided a measure of closure, however imperfect, to a case that had been open for more than 4 decades. Whether Mungo Ireland was Jack the Stripper will never be known with certainty. The forensic evidence that might have resolved the question, the paint samples, the pathology reports, the physical exhibits collected from the crime scenes, is believed to have been destroyed or lost in the intervening years. The witnesses are dead. The detectives are dead. The suspect is dead. And the case files, those that survive, are sealed, embargoed for 100 years from the date of the crimes, a decision that ensures that the full truth, if it exists anywhere in the documentary record, will not be revealed to the public until the middle of the 21st century, by which time everyone who was touched by the case will have long since passed from living memory into the silence of the archives. The note that Mungo Ireland left for his wife was his last communication with the living world. It was brief, ambiguous, and ultimately inconclusive. It answered nothing and settled nothing. It was, in its way, a perfect reflection of the case itself. A fragment of meaning surrounded by darkness, a whisper in an empty room that could be heard but not understood. The garage door was closed. The engine was silent. And the questions that Mungo Ireland took with him into the dark remained unanswered, as they remain unanswered still. Esopic. Chapter 10. The names they carried the years past, as years do, without regard for the living or the dead. The western suburbs of London changed slowly, the way cities change when no one is watching. A building demolished here, a new road laid there, the old trading estates cleared and redeveloped into housing or retail parks, or the kind of anonymous commercial units that bear no trace of what stood on the same ground a generation before. The Heron trading estate in Acton, where Bridget O'Hara had been found, and where the police had discovered the lockup with the transformer and the paint, was eventually altered beyond recognition. The spray painting shop closed. The storage sheds were pulled down. The transformer that had kept the air warm around the bodies of the dead was removed and replaced by something newer and more efficient, and the ground where it had stood was paved over and forgotten. The Thames continued to flow through Hammersmith and Chiswick and Brentford, as it had flowed for 10,000 years, carrying its freight of silt and debris and memory toward the estuary and the sea. And the women who had been pulled from its banks and its alleyways and its industrial yards were buried in graves that the city did not visit, and that bore no inscription beyond the names that had been given to them at birth, names that the newspapers had printed once or twice and then abandoned. The theories about the identity of Jack the Stripper did not cease with the death of Mungo Island, or with the retirement of John Doe Rose. They multiplied, as theories always do when the facts are insufficient to foreclose speculation, and each new theory brought with it a new suspect, a new narrative, and a new set of circumstantial connections that could be made to seem plausible if examined from the right angle and in the right light. Harold Jones was perhaps the most compelling of the alternative suspects, and his name emerged with increasing frequency in the years following the publication of Neil Milkins's book in 2011. Jones had been a convicted killer from the Welsh town of Abertillery, a boy of 15 who had murdered 2 young girls in 1921 with a violence that horrified even the hardened communities of the mining valleys. His first victim was Freda Burnell, aged 8, whom he killed and for whose murder he was tried and acquitted due to insufficient evidence. 2 weeks later, emboldened by his escape from justice, he killed Florence Little, aged 11, hiding her body in the attic of his parents' house until it was discovered by the police. He confessed to both murders and was sentenced to life imprisonment, the death penalty being unavailable to the court because of his age. He served 20 years and was released from Wandsworth Prison in 1941 at the age of 35 for what the records described as exemplary behaviour. After his release, Jones returned briefly to Abertillery, where he was seen visiting the graves of his victims, an act that could be interpreted as remorse or as something far more unsettling. The community did not welcome him. He left Wales and made his way to London, where he settled in Fulham under the name Harry Stevens, married, and fathered a daughter. He lived quietly, or appeared to live quietly, in the western suburbs, working in various manual trades, including, according to some accounts, as a metalworker and caretaker on the Heron trading estate itself. The coincidences were striking. Jones lived within a few streets of both Hannah Tailford and Bridget O'Hara. He was known to have worked on the very estate where the police found the killer's storage location. His early murders bore similarities to the stripper killings, the extreme violence, the absence of sexual assault, the storage of the body before disposal. He was small in stature, as the victims were small in stature, and his prison medical records indicated that he derived gratification not from sexual contact, but from the act of cruelty itself. He was living in the area during the period of the killings, and his whereabouts between 1962 and 1965, the precise span of the stripper murders, were unaccounted for in the official records. The case against Jones was examined in detail in a BBC documentary broadcast in January of 2019, titled Dark Sun: The Hunt for a Serial Killer. The programme, presented by the criminologist Professor David Wilson, used modern investigative techniques including geographic profiling and offender profiling to assess whether the crimes of the boy could be measured against those of the London killer. The similarities were many. The geographic profile placed the killer's likely residence within a small area of central Hammersmith, an area in which Jones was known to have lived. The offender profile described a man who was local, familiar with the area, employed in manual work, and capable of sustained violence without sexual motivation, a description that fitted Jones as closely as it fitted Mungo Island. The documentary did not reach a definitive conclusion, but it shifted the weight of public opinion toward Jones and away from the dead security guard who had been Doe Rose's preferred suspect. Jones himself had died in Hammersmith in 1971 of bone cancer at the age of 65. He had never been questioned in connection with the stripper murders. He had never been named as a suspect during the original investigation. The record-keeping failures that had allowed a convicted double murderer to live unmonitored in the same neighbourhood as the killings were never adequately explained, and the possibility that the police had simply failed to make a connection that was available to them in their own files added a further layer of institutional failure to a case that was already burdened with such failures. Other suspects were proposed with varying degrees of seriousness. In their book The Survivor, published in 2002, the former gangster Jimmy Evans and the journalist Martin Short alleged that the killer was Superintendent Tommy Butler of the Metropolitan Police's flying squad, a detective of considerable fame who had led the investigation into the Great Train robbery and who died in 1970. The allegation was extraordinary, not merely because it accused a senior police officer of serial murder, but because it suggested that the failure to solve the case was not a failure of competence, but a deliberate act of institutional self-protection. The Metropolitan Police did not dignify the allegation with a formal response, and the evidence presented by Evans and Short was largely circumstantial, resting on the testimony of underworld figures whose reliability was open to question. The former boxer Freddie Mills was another name that surfaced in connection with the case, put forward by gangster Frankie Fraser, who claimed that Mills had confessed to the killings. Mills had been the light heavyweight champion of the world from 1948 to 1950, a popular and charismatic figure who had transitioned from the ring to a career in entertainment after his retirement from boxing. He was found shot dead in his car outside a nightclub he owned in Soho on the 25th of July 1965, an apparent suicide. The suggestion that he was the stripper was based largely on anecdote and on the fact that his nightclub was frequented by women of the streets who worked the West End. The evidence was thin, and the theory was further undermined by the fact that police records of vehicle number plates in the area during the period of the killings contained no reference to any vehicle associated with Mills, a significant omission given his high profile and the thoroughness of the surveillance operation. David Seabrook, the author who had done so much to discredit the case against Mungo Ireland, claimed to have his own suspect, a former Metropolitan Police detective whose name he did not publicly reveal, but whom he described as a man who had been considered by several senior detectives investigating the case. The journalist Owen Summers had raised similar suspicions about an unnamed police officer in a series of articles published in The Sun in 1972, and the crime writer Brian McConnell had pursued the same line of inquiry in his book, Found Naked and Dead, published in 1974. The suggestion that the killer might have been a police officer carried a particular charge, because it implied not only that the investigation had been compromised from within, but that the institutional culture of the Metropolitan Police, with its code of loyalty and its resistance to internal scrutiny, had prevented the truth from emerging. None of these theories produced a conviction. None produced an arrest. None produced the kind of definitive evidence that would have allowed the case to be closed with the certainty that the families of the victims deserved and that the public had been promised. The case remained open, technically, in the files of Scotland Yard, though the practical reality was that no active investigation was being conducted, and that the prospect of a resolution diminished with each passing year as the witnesses died and the evidence deteriorated and the institutional memory of the Metropolitan Police moved on to more recent crimes. The case files themselves were embargoed, sealed for 100 years from the date of the crimes, a decision that ensured that whatever the police knew or believed they knew about the identity of the killer would not be made public until the second half of the 21st century. The embargo was justified on the grounds of protecting the privacy of individuals who had been named in the investigation but who had never been charged, a reasonable concern in a case that had generated so many suspects and so few certainties. But the embargo also served to protect the Metropolitan Police from the scrutiny that a full disclosure of the files might invite, and it ensured that the institutional failures that had characterized the investigation, the initial dismissal of Hannah Tailford's death as suicide, the failure to connect the earlier killings to the later ones, the failure to identify Harold Jones as a potential suspect despite his criminal record, the possible framing of Mungo Ireland would not be subjected to public examination for generations to come. What remained in the absence of a conviction or even a definitive identification were the names of the women. Elizabeth Figg, 21, from Cheshire, found on rough ground near the Thames in Chiswick on the 17th of June 1959. Gwynneth Rees, 22, from Wales, found in a refuse tip in Mortlake on the 8th of November 1963. Hannah Tailford, 30, from the northeast of England, found on the Thames foreshore near Hammersmith Bridge on the 2nd of February 1964, mother of 2, pregnant with her 3rd child. Irene Lockwood, 26, from Nottinghamshire, found on the Thames foreshore at Corney Reach, Chiswick, on the 8th of April 1964, pregnant at the time of her death. Helen Barthelemy, 22, from Scotland, found in an alleyway in Brentford on the 24th of April 1964. Mary Fleming, 30, from Scotland, found on Berrymead Road, Chiswick, on the 14th of July 1964. Margaret McGowan, also known as Frances Brown, 21, found in a car park on Hornton Street, Kensington, on the 25th of November 1964, witness at the trial of Stephen Ward. Bridget O'Hara, 28, from Dublin, found on the Heron trading estate, Acton, on the 16th of February 1965. 8 women. 8 lives that had been lived in the margins of a city that did not care to look at them, and that were ended in violence and disposed of with contempt. They had come from mining towns and farming villages and the grey streets of industrial cities, and they had made their way to London because London was where the future was supposed to be, and they had found instead a present that was cold and dangerous and that offered them nothing except the choice between poverty and risk. They had been daughters. Some had been mothers. All had been someone's child, born into a world that had failed them long before the killer found them on the streets of West London. The city did not mourn them. There were no memorials erected in the parks where they had walked, no plaques fixed to the walls of the buildings where they had lived, no annual services of remembrance held in the churches of Hammersmith or Chiswick or Acton. The newspapers that had printed their names in the weeks after their deaths moved on to other stories, other scandals, other crimes. The politicians who had expressed their concern in the House of Commons turned their attention to other matters. The police officers who had investigated the case retired and wrote their memoirs and died. And the women themselves, who had never been given much by the world in which they lived, were given nothing by the world that survived them, nothing except the silence that had always been their portion. The case of Jack the Stripper remains, to this day, the largest unsolved serial murder case in the history of British policing. It has been the subject of books and documentaries and academic papers, each offering a different theory, a different suspect, a different reading of the evidence. But no reading of the evidence can change the fundamental fact that the killer was never identified, never arrested, never tried, and never punished. The women he killed were denied justice in death as they had been denied dignity in life. And the questions that their deaths raised, about the value that society places on the lives of its most vulnerable members, about the willingness of institutions to protect those who exist beyond the boundaries of respectability, about the capacity of a great city to harbour a predator in its midst and fail to find him, remain as urgent and unanswered as they were in the winter of 1965, when the last body was found on the Heron trading estate and the fog rolled in from the river and the city turned, as it always turned, to the nut begrecht and the nest kfabakate. The river flows on. It carries no names. It keeps no record of what it has received or what it has surrendered. The tide rises and falls, and the foreshore is covered and uncovered, and the stones that line the bank are worn smooth by the passage of water that has been passing since before the city was built, and that will continue to pass long after the city has fallen. The women who were left on those stones are gone now, their bodies returned to the earth, their stories told in fragments by writers who never knew them, and who can only guess at the shape of their days, and the texture of their fears. But they had names. They were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They were not symbols of anything larger than themselves. They were women who lived and suffered and died, and the fact that no one was ever held accountable for their deaths does not diminish the reality of those deaths, or the weight of the loss that each one represented. They had names, and those names are the only monument that the city ever gave them, and it is with those names that this story must end. Elizabeth, Gwynneth, Hannah, Irene, Helen, Mary, Margaret, Bridget. The candle has burned low. The chamber has grown still, and history, once again, turns the page in the dark.